Original sexual assault of women is not guilty? How much power does the U.S. military stationed in South Korea have, and South Korea does not dare to breathe? American soldiers sexually assaulted Korean women again. Why do you say again? Because this kind of thing happens to the U.S. military in Korea or the U.S. military in Japan. We have long been accustomed to it. This sexual assault incident is similar to the countless sexual assault cases created by the U.S. military in South Korea in the past. The South Korean woman was brought into the base of the 8th Combat Flight Regiment of the U.S. Air Force by U.S. soldiers stationed in South Korea, and was forced by a U.S. military to have human connection when drunk and unconscious. And the next day, the South Korean woman ran away from the gate of the base and shouted, "I was sexually assaulted. Help me." After being discovered by military officers, she was handed over to the U.S. Gendarmerie. The incident occurred at the gate of the U.S. military base in South Korea. The progress of the case is basically the same as in the past. The U.S. soldiers refused to admit guilt, and the U.S. military stationed in South Korea shielded their own people. The South Korean police had no choice, and only after 7 months of the case did they seize the suspect's mobile phone, and they could not even see the suspect's face. Therefore, recently, South Koreans have taken to the streets or picked up keyboards to protest the atrocities of the U.S. military. In fact, all South Koreans can do is to be incompetent and angry, vent their anger on the internet, and in reality dare not touch the U.S. military with a finger. The probability of this sexual assault case is still the same as before. The big thing is small. The small matter is turned into a small matter, and the U.S. soldiers are either a small punishment or acquitted. Isn't it normal for dad to hit son? After all, we always say that the South Korean army does not even have a wartime command, and the U.S. military stationed in South Korea is a father like a father, and in peacetime, only the father beats his son, and the son dares to shout a few words at most, and he does not dare to fight back if he gives it a few dares. So what kind of existence is the U.S. military in Korea? How big are the rights of U.S. forces in Korea? Does the ROK really have no wartime command? Created the American forces of South Korea in Korea? Why is there a U.S. military presence in South Korea? I believe that many friends will give a direct answer to this question, because in the Korean War, the South Korean army was violently beaten by the North Korean army, so South Korea needs the protection of the U.S. military. Is this really the case? On the soil of the present South Korea, was there Korea first or the U.S. military first? Prior to Japan's defeat and surrender in August 1945, there was no Republic of Korea, ROK, on the Korean peninsula. Of course, there is no Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, either. At that time, the Korean peninsula was a colony and ruled by the Japanese. In August 1945, the Soviet Eighth Army launched an offensive on the Korean peninsula, quickly eliminating the Japanese forces in the northern part of the peninsula and preparing to move south at any time. Let the USSR annex the Korean peninsula alone? The Americans would not let that happen. After the agreement between the two countries, the 38th parallel north latitude on the Korean peninsula became the temporary demarcation line between the Soviet and American military operations against Japan and the scope of surrender, with the Soviet military landing area in the north and the U.S. military landing area in the south. According to the agreement, American forces entered the southern part of the Korean peninsula after September 1945 to accept the surrender of Japanese forces, which is now South Korean territory. In 9, the United States Military Administration organized the South Korean election, and Syngman Rhee, supported by the United States, was successfully elected president and established the Republic of Korea. Therefore, if you really want to trace the origin of South Korea, the United States can indeed be called South Korea's father. And after the establishment of South Korea, the U.S. military withdrew all combat troops on the Korean peninsula by June 1949-6, except for a military advisory group of several hundred people. However, a year later, the Korean War broke out, and in just a few months South Korea was about to be destroyed, and in order to hold the last territory of the East Asian continent, American troops quickly returned to South Korea to help defend against the Korean People's Army. Everyone is very familiar with the history behind. In the Korean War, the number of U.S. troops on South Korean soil reached its peak, and ground forces such as the 8th Army, the 1st Army, the 9th Army, and the 10th Army were successively deployed, as well as a large number of naval and air forces. However, it should be noted that the U.S. military in North Korea is not all American. There are also a large number of Koreans who were recruited directly from South Korea and integrated into the U.S. military, the so-called Katusa of the U.S. Army in Korea. The identity of these people is quite special, although they are Koreans, but not the Korean Army but the American Army. Although it is the U.S. military, it is not counted as U.S. casualties after the death in the war, and it cannot be included in the casualties of the South Korean Army. What is it? Probably similar in nature to the later M72 anti-tank bazooka, disposable after use, real consumables. After the signing of the Korean Armistice in 1953, U.S. troops did not withdraw from the Korean peninsula like the Chinese volunteers. After all, the Americans fought side by side with the South Korean Army and knew the quality of this army. In order to reassure South Korea and increase its control over South Korea, in October 1953, the United States and South Korea signed the USROK Mutual Defense Treaty, which clearly stated that South Korea grants the United States the right to deploy land, sea, and air forces in and around its territory. The United States has gained the right to station troops in South Korea for a long time, and if either side is attacked, it must send troops to assist. As a result, U.S. troops remained on South Korean territory and became the United States Forces Korea, USFK. During the Cold War, tens of thousands of U.S. troops stationed in South Korea spread across 19 bases throughout South Korea, always on the guard against the Korean People's Army and even the Soviet armed forces going south to attack South Korea. After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. military in South Korea was like the U.S. military in Europe. However, it still maintained a considerable size and deployed a large amount of advanced equipment. At present, the entire U.S. military stationed in South Korea maintains a size of 29 people, including the 8th Army of the Army, with a strength of about 8,900 troops, the 7th Air Force of the Air Force, with a strength of about 300,300 people, the Navy 7th Fleet, with a strength of about 60 men. However, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Let the Americans help you look at the yard, and then naturally there is a price. So with the permission of the South Korean government, the U.S. military stationed in South Korea has various privileges that humiliate the South Korean people but have no choice. How privileged are the Draco U.S. troops stationed in Korea? Generally speaking, according to international law, foreign troops should abide by the laws of the country in which they are stationed, but in order to protect the rights and interests of the garrison and military families, the two sides will provide certain facilities within the scope of the law. However, from the very beginning, the U.S. military stationed in Korea had a special legal status and various conveniences of high Korean first class. During the U.S. military rule from 1945 to 1948, U.S. law was Korean law, and the U.S. military served all court trials, judges were Americans, and even Koreans were tried in English-language courts. Beginning with the outbreak of the Korean War, the South Korean government signed the Korea-U.S. Agreement on the jurisdiction of U.S. forces in Korea on July 1957, in order to plead with the Americans to send troops to help fight the war as soon as possible. Because it is a matter of seeking people to do things, the provisions in the Taejeon Agreement must be greatly beneficial to the U.S. side, and to some extent, it is no longer an unequal treaty but a traitorous treaty. For example, it is directly agreed that the U.S. military has extraterritoriality, and South Korea has no right to judge the criminal actions of U.S. military personnel in South Korea, and can only be tried by the United States. This is tantamount to saying that no matter what American soldiers do to kill and set fire to people in South Korea, the Americans themselves will handle it, and you Koreans can't control it. During the Korean War, the U.S. military committed many large-scale massacres of innocent people, but none of them went unpunished. For example, the Laejeonri incident saw the U.S. military massacre about 400 villagers, mostly women and children, at one time in the village of Laoganri in Cheongcheongbuk-do, South Korea. Only 50 years later did the United States admit that the soldiers were too panicked. To be able to claim such a large right from South Korea is indeed very much in line with MacArthur's style. If you can be an emperor in Japan, you must naturally be a father in Korea. As a result, the Korean people have such a group of dads who are outside the law. The Korean War was truce in 1953. If only during the war could the Korean people endure dads doing something to steal chickens and dogs. After the war, the people who began to return to normal life slowly began to unacceptable these behaviors. At the same time, the behavior of the U.S. military stationed in South Korea is still unabated, drinking and provoking trouble, driving into people, robbing finances, raping women. Occur. The impression of ordinary South Koreans about the U.S. military has gradually changed from heroes who protect us to villains who remain in our country. The South Korean people's anti-American consciousness began to rise, and the South Korean government also felt the pressure from the people, so it began to seek negotiations with the U.S. government, hoping to sign a new troop agreement to limit the behavior of the U.S. military. Well, then renegotiate the signing of the agreement. Soon the negotiations came to fruition. In 1966, the United States and South Korea re-signed the Status of Forces Agreement, SOFA, to replace the Daejeon Agreement, which entered into force on February 1967, too. Judging from the text, the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea is still a great improvement over the Daejeon Agreement. For example, South Koreans can detain U.S. military personnel who commit 12 heinous crimes, including homicide, rape, drug trafficking, and assault to death. Does text work? Of course it didn't work. If the words worked, the U.S. military stationed in Korea would be honest by now. You have restrictions on me, and I will add restrictions to you. As a model of lawyers' governance, playing with legal provisions can be said to be the strength of Americans. In the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea, Americans also added a large number of clauses restricting South Korea's exercise of judicial power. For example, after the U.S. military stationed in South Korea is captured by the South Korean Law Enforcement Department for a crime, as long as the U.S. military demands, the South Korean side must immediately transfer the suspect to the U.S. side without delay. You see, even if there is a vicious crime, the Americans open their mouths to ask for people, and the Koreans have to hand them over. If you don't get caught by the Koreans after committing a crime, then there is no need to be afraid. The Status of Forces Agreement on the United States in Korea stipulates that if the suspect is detained by the United States first, no matter what reason the South Koreans have, the United States does not have to hand them over to the South Korean side. Just like this sexual assault case, the South Koreans can't even see anyone. Even if the South Koreans catch the suspect, the Americans don't ask for anyone, so don't be afraid. Because the Status of Forces in Korea agreement also stipulates that if the U.S. military asks South Korea to give up the right to trial, as long as there are no special circumstances, the South Korean side should waive the right to trial. Look, what a thoughtful clause that directly makes you give up the trial. So, has there been any progress from the Daejeon Agreement to the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea? Yes, the face of the South Koreans is better, and the extraterritoriality of the U.S. military stationed in South Korea has been weakened on paper. As for the essence, from the 70s of the last century to today, the killing of Eun Gini, the riot at the Cheongmuro subway station, the McCarthy private incident, the U.S. military discharging highly toxic substances into the Han River, the armored car crushing female middle school student incident. As for what beating passers-by, knife robbery, rape, etc. are even more commonplace anyway, the criminal acts of the U.S. military stationed in South Korea have not converged at all. Therefore, soon after the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea came into effect, the South Korean people began to demand the revision of the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea, or continue to amend the provisions. As a result, from 1967 to the present, the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea has undergone several revisions. However, words are words, and the privileges of U.S. troops in Korea have not changed substantially. Until now, few U.S. troops have been arrested for criminal acts and then extradited to South Korea for criminal punishment. Moreover, rape cases are particularly common among crimes committed by American soldiers, who believe that they saved South Korea, which is about to collapse, and that South Korea needs to be grateful to them. Former U.S. Army Pastor Keston reported to the U.S. government in 1964, 90% of U.S. soldiers in Korea have immoral sex, such as a soldier who had illegal sex with a prostitute while in office, and after returning to the United States, he sold the woman, house, and furniture to the newly arrived soldier. United States, a colony must look like a colony, and it must know its identity. Of course, the Status of Forces Agreement in Korea, as a colonial guide that Americans stuffed to South Koreans, in addition to giving a large number of privileges to U.S. troops in Korea, also restricted many normal national rights in South Korea. For example, the command of the South Korean Army. Can South Korea command its own army? The fact that the South Korean Army has no wartime command is something that netizens often ridicule. If a country does not have command of an army, then this country is no different from a puppet. In the Korean War, the ROK Army did not have its own independent command. At the beginning of the war, the South Korean Army was defeated by the armored torrent of the North Korean T-34 and retreated into the Pusan Defense Circle. Syngman Rhee took advantage of the situation and handed over the command of the army to the Israeli U.S. Army. The signing of the Taejeon Agreement made the ROK military directly subordinate to the U.S. military in terms of legal status, becoming a complete vassal. After the end of the Korean War, under the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty signed by South Korea and the United States, South Korea explicitly handed over military command to the U.S. military. In 1957, the U.S. Army established the U.S. Forces Korea Command at the Yongsan Base in South Korea, which was directly responsible for commanding U.S. forces in Korea and all South Korean forces. In 1978, the two countries jointly established the U.S.-South Korea Joint Command, which is responsible for the unified operational command system of the two militaries. A U.S. general, usually the commander of U.S. forces in Korea, serves as the commander of the U.S.-Korea Joint Command, commanding U.S. and South Korean forces. At the same time, a South Korean general served as deputy commander of the U.S.-South Korea Joint Command, responsible for receiving U.S. military command. The name is USROK Joint Command. The slogan is "We go together." In fact, naturally the South Korean Army is in front and the U.S. military is behind. After all, only the U.S. military can command the South Korean Army, and the South Korean Army cannot command the U.S. Army. Therefore, in the history of South Korea, leaders with even a little political ambition will always want the U.S. military to return the command of the South Korean military, which has its own army, and it has no right to command. Regular discussions on the return of command authority have become a routine action of the South Korean and U.S. governments. In 1994, after repeated negotiations, the United States returned peacetime operational command to South Korea. At this point, it has to be said that Americans are indeed chicken thieves. Divide the command into two parts. First, return the innocuous and easily stigmatized peacetime combat command, and keep the key wartime command in his own hands. In the Gwangju incident in 1980, the South Korean people were punched hard by the South Korean Army, and suffered heavy casualties. As an act of using peacetime operational command in non-war times, whoever orders is responsible. The Americans, who had full command of the South Korean army at that time, would not admit it, and they have been pretending to be deaf and dumb until now. And the South Korean President young General Chun Doo-hwan, who had no command power, carried all the pots alone. Surrounding the return of the remaining wartime command, South Korea and the United States have been pulling until now. But in essence, behind the issue of the handover of command in wartime is the issue of inter-Korean relations. After Roh, who had been working to improve relations with North Korea, became president, he pursued a policy of independent national defense and actively demanded that the Americans return command. On September 2006, 9, and February 14, 2007, the United States held summit talks and defense ministers' talks, and agreed to transfer wartime operational command to the ROK in April 2nd. After Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye came to power, South Korea turned to the right in an all-round way, and relations between the two Koreas were tense. The transfer of operational command in wartime began to be delayed. The Americans did not want to pay it, and the South Korean president did not want to accept it. The 2012 deadline was continuously delayed, and the two sides held separate consultations in 2013 and 2014, but no results were achieved. Then, Roh's friend Ko-spy Moon Jae-in came to power, and relations between the two Koreas improved again, and the issue of wartime command was put on the table again. In May 2018, South Korea again gave a deadline for taking back wartime command from U.S. forces in South Korea. South Korean Defense Minister Song Yong-moo said he hoped to take back wartime operational command after completing military reform in 5. Now that the pro-American Yoon Suk-yeol is the president of South Korea, as another president who has turned right with South Korea, it is likely that the command issue will continue to be postponed in accordance with the intentions of the Americans. Before the resumption of wartime operational command, if a war breaks out on the Korean peninsula, the status and role of the ROK military will not be much different from that of 1950, and it will still be used as the vanguard of the U.S. military. Therefore, the final outcome of the sexual assault of South Korean women by U.S. troops stationed in South Korea is actually not important, and the reactions of all parties have long been in the script. As the savior of the privileged South Korean government, the father of the Korean people, and the superior boss of the Korean military, the U.S. military stationed in South Korea, with the cooperation of the U.S. media, will definitely find a way to eliminate the impact of this matter invisibly. However, if the state power itself does not want to stand up, still likes to kneel on the ground to deal with the Americans, is willing to give a lot of privileges to foreign troops, and gives up its own independence and freedom to liberate, then the criminal behavior of the U.S. military stationed in South Korea will not change in any way, and it will certainly continue to cause all kinds of trouble for the South Korean people in the future.